The government scores its first big free trade agreement in a decade. What does this mean for ties between India and the United Arab Emirates and for the larger Gulf region? Hello and welcome to Worldview at the Hindu with me, Suhasini Haidar. Now, India and the UAE have announced the launch of their free trade agreement, or what is formally called the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or CEPA. As Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the UAE Deputy Commander of Forces, as well as the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, held a virtual summit on Friday. Now remember, Prime Minister Modi was due to visit Abu Dhabi in January, and that trip had to be cancelled due to the Omicron wave of COVID. And while he might still go next month, before, in fact, the Dubai Expo ends on March 31st, he is due to visit that, the two sides have clearly decided to delay the launch of the CEPA no further. The agreement is very much a first in many ways. It's a first for the Modi government, which until 2020 had really eschewed all free trade agreements, called them unfair to India, cancelled all bilateral investment treaties, walked out of RCEP negotiations, remember, with Southeast Asia, China, Australia, and Japan, after 8 years. This is, in fact, the first big free trade agreement being signed by India in 10 years. Although it did sign the CECPA with Mauritius in February 2021, that was not seen as large a deal. It's also a first amongst other FTAs that are being negotiated today. So there's one with the United Kingdom, also Australia. Now, both of these have timelines attached and should be completed this year itself, but the UAE is really the first. There are other FTA negotiations as well with the EU, Gulf countries, as well as Canada. But as I said, the UAE is the first. For the UAE, which has the benefit of several FTAs within the Gulf Cooperation Council of 6 states. Now, these are Arab monarchies, basically. Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. But this is one of the first FTAs, the one with India, that it has signed independently outside of the GCC. So what will the India-UAE CEPA really mean for relations between them? The first is obviously that it will give a push to bilateral trade, which at present is valued at about $59 billion pre-pandemic. And in 2019, UAE was the third largest trading partner for India. India was the UAE's second largest trading partner for non-oil trade. They hope now to take this $50 billion odd to double it in the next 5 years. Now, this could also mean more UAE investment, currently billed at about $18 billion in India, of which about $11.6 billion is actually FDI. The rest is portfolio investment. So that's a very important source. I think the UAE is the 9th largest investor in India. The CEPA with the UAE could also pave the way for a broader FTA with GCC countries, for which a framework agreement was actually signed in 2004. FTA talks were launched in 2006, but they've been abandoned since then. So this could become the way to the GCC FTA as well. And it also means more engagement through the West Asian Quad, or the MEQ, which we've spoken about at Worldview before. That was launched last year between US, Israel, India, and the UAE as a platform for economic cooperation. Now, trade is clearly one of the big pillars of ties between India and the UAE, also with the entire Gulf region. Just take a look at some of the history. In fact, it dates back, documented to about 4,000 years, right back to links between the Mesopotamian and the Indus Valley civilizations. The trade, which has been done over the centuries by barter, focused traditionally on goods like dates, like pearls, frankincense and myrrh, and fish coming from the Gulf, whereas Indian finished goods really became the bulk of supplies to the Arabian Peninsula. This became a big part of all the goods available in this region for some centuries. The British controlled the Gulf then from the Bombay Presidency. Few would in fact know that until the 1870s, the Indian rupee was actually legal tender in 5 of the 6 GCC states, all except Saudi Arabia. Today, India and UAE, as I said, are aiming to cross $100 billion in bilateral trade in the next 5 years, where apart from fuel, there's apparel, gems and jewelry, electric machinery, all powering the relationship. But there is more. Energy is that other big pillar between the two. In the modern world, we really look to 1962, when India first imported oil from Abu Dhabi, and even changed the balance of ties really once the Arab world really discovered so much more oil. In 2020, for example, by 2020, Saudi Arabia was exporting about 38 million tons to India. The UAE was sending about 22 million tons. They were the second and third largest source of India's oil imports, constituting about half of India's crude requirements. This, of course, after India decided to cut and zero out its oil supplies from Iran under pressure from the United States. The third is labor. And each of these is a very strong pillar that the two countries' ties stand on. India's vast migrant labor population to the Gulf is about 8 million in all. And in the UAE, about 3.5 million Indians work there. They're the largest ethnic community, about 30% of the population. And you see them in all walks of services, from administrative and health and tourism and labor. Anyone who's visited the UAE can tell you that. They send home remittances of about $14 billion a year, quite a large chunk, in fact, of all of India's remittances. And apart from those very big people-to-people ties, it is the ties between the leaders of the two countries that we've seen particularly strengthened in the last few weeks. Prime Minister Modi's government is really given the biggest credit because when he traveled to the UAE in 2015, it was the first in decades by an Indian PM. Both, in fact, since then have made rare exceptions for the other. In 2017, Mr. Modi invited MBZ, as he's called, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, who's not a head of state or a head of government, but he was invited as the Republic Day chief guest for the first time. And then in April 2019, the UAE did something unusual, decided to award Mr. Modi its highest civilian order. It's called the Order of Zayed. But what was interesting and why it caused a lot of comment was that that award was given right as Indian elections were underway. In 2019, in fact, ties had grown so close between the two that the UAE even invited External Affairs Minister, former and now late External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj, to address the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, or the OIC grouping. India is, of course, not a part of and has a tense relationship with. So these were some of the relationships, big pillars. New areas of cooperation have come up as well. The first is in the area of defense and strategic partnerships. India and the UAE signed a comprehensive strategic partnership in 2017. They hold annual defense dialogues. More recently, of course, the UAE is a key part of the Indian Ocean region dialogue, so both welcoming each other into their regions. India takes part in military exercises. Military chiefs, including General Naravane, have visited. Then there is the area of terrorism, where we've seen a real shift in the policy from the Gulf, from being seen as a safe haven for some of India's most wanted terrorists and underworld figures, most notably Dawood Ibrahim. Post-2001, we actually saw a shift in the UAE's policies, and now they cooperate, especially after 26/11 and the Mumbai attacks. We've seen them cooperating with India, both on extraditing fugitives and terror suspects, as well as intelligence sharing. Then the big shift came in 2019 over Jammu and Kashmir. After the Modi government's move on Article 370 and bifurcating Jammu Kashmir, the UAE was one of the first countries to offer its support, has subsequently signed a number of MOUs promising investment and infrastructure in J&K, and launched the possibility of a new flight between Sharjah and Srinagar. Now, why is this significant? Is because the UAE had traditionally supported Pakistan on the issue, and so this really denotes a new area of cooperation with India. An interesting aside is, in fact, the role that the UAE says it has played in mediation between India and Pakistan. And over the past 3 years, Dubai has allegedly facilitated meetings between interlocutors, including National Security Advisor Doval and Pakistan military officials. And finally, this is a big area. India and the UAE have signed a number of digital innovation, technology partnership, and also plans for ISRO and the UAE Space Agency to cooperate, missions like the Red Planet mission. The Emirates has also offered golden visa residency permits for doctors, engineers, PhD scholars, specialists in high-end technology fields, artificial intelligence, big data, virology, and epidemiology. And of course, one of the most high-profile of those taking that golden visa were former ISRO chief K. Radhakrishnan, who went over to the UAE Space Agency. So given all these new and vast areas of cooperation, where are the areas where India and the UAE face their biggest challenges? One is, of course, in balancing geopolitics. India has its close ties with Iran, and this has really led to some tensions with the UAE. This played out over Yemen as well, but then India was very unequivocal in its support for the UAE when those attacks by Houthi groups in the UAE, where 2 Indians and a Pakistani were killed a month ago. The UAE also has a relationship with China, but this has not so far gotten in the way of the relationship with India. Then there is the issue of energy pricing, because remember, as an OPEC country, UAE is on the other side of the debate, where India, as a major oil consumer, is here arguing for a cap on prices. And this has seen some heated words between oil ministers in the past, although the UAE has always been understanding of India's position. However, India and UAE have another issue, and that is that they are yet to renegotiate an air services agreement. This has really become a thorn in tie, something their ambassador refers to quite a lot, because the UAE wants to increase the number of flights to India, as well as the number of destinations they fly to. But India continues to cap these in order, it says, to protect Indian airlines. Then there is the issue of the treatment of Indian labor, and it's something that frequently flares up. Firstly, Indians aren't granted citizenship in the UAE. Therefore, there's always a worry about their welfare as well as conditions at Indian labor camps in particular that become a matter of concern. And then the big concern, during the pandemic, much of the labor to the Gulf has had to return back to India. Remittances are likely to be slashed as much as 25% in the next few years, and the question of when the UAE will take them all back. Then there is this other big new issue, really, which is the treatment of minorities in India. After the Citizenship Amendment Act protests, we saw many social media controversies. Now the hijab ban has raised concerns in Gulf countries. The OIC issued a very strong statement, which India rejected. And conversely, although very few, less than 100 Indians based in the Gulf actually joined ISIS and earlier joined Al-Qaeda, I think very, very few, the export of radicalization on both sides is always going to be a concern between countries that have such close ties. Clearly, the Gulf, and particularly the UAE, is an old relationship made new with India in the last few years. And while the Modi government has made great strides in strengthening relations at the top, it must watch for a reaction in Islamic Gulf countries to India's domestic tensions very closely, especially given the numbers of Indians that live in the region. An area that we hope to track much more for you in the future. Here at Worldview, we do have book recommendations for you, and there really aren't as many books on the subject of India and the Gulf as there should be. One expert to follow is P.R. Kumaraswamy, professor at JNU, who nearly every year has brought out an edition of Persian Gulf, India's relations with the region. Most recently, I think he brought this out in 2020. Another expert from JNU, A.K. Pasha, has written India and the Gulf region. It's a slightly older book, but it's about maritime history, trade, security, and political reforms. Then there is a volume called Developments in the Gulf Region, Prospects and Challenges for India in the Next 2 Decades. It's definitely a very interesting work edited by Brigadier Rumel Dahiya of the IDSA, Institute of Defense and Strategic Analysis, that focuses on post-Arab Spring developments in particular. Then there is this lovely book. It's delightful because of all the pictures as well, and the history and the presence of ties, relationship between India and the UAE. It's called In Celebration of a Legendary Friendship. This is by a former diplomat, Venu Rajamani, who was actually posted to the UAE as well. Then there is a book called The Islamic Connection, South Asia and the Gulf by Christophe Jaffrelot. Now remember, this is of course a book that talks about the links between the Gulf and all of South Asia, and particularly the Islamic connection. But Jaffrelot has written several books about South Asia, most recently on Modi's India and the rise of Hindu nationalism, which is certainly very interesting. And finally, there is the Arabian frontier of the British Raj, merchants, rulers, and the British in the 19th century Gulf. And this is the history I was speaking about. It has monographs in it. I've only seen a few off the plates, but they're certainly very interesting. It's a very expensive book, even on Kindle. So hopefully you can access it, reference it. But it tells you all about how the British made the connection between the two regions and how both the Gulf and South Asia have a shared experience of capitalism and colonialism. So those are some of the books we hope you do find very interesting. And that's all we have time for here on Worldview, but from the team here. Thanks for watching.